I think probably we should just start because the pictures from Los Angeles are so dramatic. We were saying that this is the fire in Pacific Palisades alone is like the whole of Norwich.
Yes.
Bigger than the whole of Reading being on fire. It's shocking to see, but I think also, given that we're sort of also talking politics, Joe Biden, about to stand down as president, just cancelled a trip. It's likely to be his last public event talking about this. In a week or so's time, 10 days' time, we'll have President Donald Trump. It'll be a rather kind of contrasting approach to handling these kind of issues, I would guess.
Yeah, I think so. Look, I think one of the things that struck me about it, I mean, I've been to LA a couple of times, is that if you know LA, this is like a very, very high-scale area. You know, some of the homes that have been affected are, you know, multi-million-dollar homes. And generally, you'd expect in a very, very wealthy country, a very wealthy area, people to be able, the authorities could deal with these natural disasters, but they can't. It's, you know, it's human, it's nature against very sophisticated human communities. And the power of nature is just extraordinary. And I'm very, very sad that, you know, people have lost their lives. But I think it's, you know, it's just a testament to the fact that you can't fight things like climate and fires and winds and storms. It's very difficult to do.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because, of course, as you say, Donald Trump has been a sceptic around climate change and so on. I mean, what does happen? How does he approach this? If, you know, this obviously, it's the worst that they've seen. It may not be the last time this happens.
Sure.
And can he continue to be sceptical about the effects of climate change in the face of the evidence that appears to be raging?
I mean, these fires are so horrific and, you know, our hearts just go out to everyone involved. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of interest because it is hitting where the celebrities live and that's been a factor. But, you know, I've got friends out there, I was just looking at their Facebook posts, just ordinary people who've completely lost their homes, just like that. It's absolutely terrifying. I mean, to your point, Ed, about the political backdrop, I mean, let's hope this is not a metaphor of some kind, these kind of raging fires. And there is going to be a very, very different approach that the new incoming administration is going to take. Now, there'll be some people who argue, well, look, this is just life, this just happens. But I think it's very wrong-headed to completely ignore the issue of climate change and extreme weather in all of this. There'll be some people on the Republican side saying, we can't afford net zero, we can't afford to do climate change. There'll be lots of people that have lost their homes, businesses saying, we can't afford not to ignore this as well.
And I think the issue with the climate change is that I don't think Donald Trump's position is that the climate hasn't changed. That the debate is about man-made climate change. And obviously, most people, there's a consensus around the fact that emitting carbon, fossil fuels, does contribute to this. But there's a large section in the Republican Party that would reject that.
Yeah.
And that's where the debate is. I mean, no one's saying that, you know, these extreme weather events aren't happening. But they are they are questioning what the causes are.
How you deal with them and how much resource you put into it.
That's the issue, exactly.
How much pressure you put on the average person to change their lifestyle.
Exactly right. That's
the taxes you put on those big industries.
And I think those things are incredibly... I mean, they're very pertinent issues all over the world. We've had it in this country as well, like anything to do with the car. But in America particularly, anything to do with the car and petrol and gas is just such a... It's, so totemic to people. And particularly in LA, you know, people drive. I mean, last time... Whenever I've been to LA, it's not like you get public transport or you walk. Everybody drives, you know, the gridlock,
There's total gridlock.
Yeah.
Shall we move from firefighting in Los Angeles to firefighting at the Treasury? Something, Kwasi, you know
I've heard about
a little bit about. We're now in a position where, you know, big rise in long-term interest rates around the world the last couple of weeks, but it's been, over the last year, hitting the UK harder. The level of long-term interest rates, which determines how much the government has to pay on the interest for all of that national debt, that level of interest rates is now higher than it jumped up to
when I was in
the
office.
Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng period. Now, you are the best person to learn lessons and to give advice.
OK, so
Rachel Reeves, how should she react?
So the first thing she shouldn't do is panic. That would be, or the Prime Minister. I think
like Liz Truss did?
Well, I'm not saying anything about that, but she shouldn't panic. The second thing she has to do is she's got to get out the message in terms of how she's actually going to get growth in the economy. Because if you remember, in 2022, it was all about growth. It's all about trying to generate revenues so that you can pay for public services. And if you can't do that, the markets will judge you very adversely. And I think the government it's got 4 years to run, and they need to have a very convincing growth narrative and plan. Without that, you're going to see, I think, higher rates. You're going to see higher mortgage rates. You're going to see higher interest rates because the market won't be convinced.
And do you think the markets, are the markets doubting her commitment to fiscal discipline and tough decisions on the fiscal rules, or are they doubting whether there's actually a growth plan which will work?
So I think the big question mark is about growth. I think people can see that she's very publicly said that she's going to stick to the fiscal rules. She's very wary. She took 4 months. They took 4 months before they gave the budget.
Can you just explain the fiscal rules? I think for people at home, possibly some of this is quite complicated, isn't it?
I mean,
what are her basic rules that she will not break?
In very simple terms, the fiscal rules determine how much money you can spend within a certain period.
Yeah.
And they call it the envelope. Like an envelope, it's very limited, and you've got to stay within the envelope over the course of 4 or 5 years. Put very simply, now the problem is that if you don't grow the economy fast, it's like any. I know people don't like talking about household economics, but if your income isn't going up, that limits the amount of money you can spend.
Yeah.
And the markets are looking at the UK as an economy and saying, if it's not growing, how are they going to pay for the National Health Service? How are they going to pay for
and the teachers'
defence?
pay rise and so on, which I think, I mean, for those teachers, they might be breathing a sigh of relief that came in before this happened, because had it happened the other way round, Rachel Reeves may well have had to make different decisions around those public sector pay rises, might she, Ayesha? And in terms of us at home, people living their lives, it's about those individual departments, isn't it, that will now be feeling very nervous, presumably social care, the courts, welfare, you know, all of those things that affect our daily lives. Is that going to stop being cut even more?
Well, that's the real anxiety that people have, particularly after, you know, what people called the austerity years, where things were really, really cut, and people saw the effects of that in their everyday lives and their communities. And one of the things that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer really wanted to make clear at the last budget, and a very important budget for this incoming Labour government, was they didn't want a return to austerity. And they did manage to actually put in quite a considerable amount of money into things like the NHS. However, the big anxiety is what is going to happen. I mean, everybody is betting the house on growth. And
That's right.
We really, really have to hope that growth is going to kick in. Now, I think that there's some very, very good plans that the government have set out. They will take time, things like planning reform, house building, skills, you know, all of that kind of stuff is very... Hopefully we'll try and get a better trading relationship with the EU as well, which is our biggest, nearest trading partner as well. But this is very difficult. And I think one of the things that we have to be aware about, we just talked about Donald Trump earlier, we are also at the mercy, you know, we can do our domestic fiscal policy, but we are also very affected by what happens internationally, with the markets internationally as well.
There are other countries who have faced this increased borrowing rate.
But we're also entering a period of you know, great instability. We don't know what's going to happen with Donald Trump. We don't know, you know, if there's going to be tariffs or a trade war or anything like that. So at the
Ukraine,
moment,
the cost of that.
We don't know what's going to happen with Russia, with this war, with the Middle East. So we are entering an incredibly precarious time in terms of not just domestic economics, but global economics.
And you will
as well.
know, I mean, in the political context, governments always talk about the global forces. And oppositions will say, no, forget about that. It's your fault. I mean, that's just the nature of the political debate.
And it's normally a bit of both.
And it is. And you suffer from that. I've suffered. Exactly.
You were right, Ayesha. Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer both said before the budget, no return to austerity. 3 months on, pressure in the global financial markets, rising cost of borrowing in Britain. The Treasury is saying, we're not going to break our fiscal rules and borrow more. No more tax rises. We'd have to cut spending. I mean, that sounds like a return to austerity.
And if that is the case, that's going to be really, really that's going to be very difficult. I mean, you know that, I know that, we all know that. We know, Ed and I particularly, in terms of the sort of Labour family, that will be very difficult as well. Really, and it's not just your ideology. There are many sections of public services that your viewers all rely on, from social care to education,
bin
to
collections,
the bin collection, the police, and those services are really on their knees. So, you know,
it's not in the DNA of the Labour Party to cut spending. I mean, let's be honest. And historically, it's been very difficult for them to do that. I think in the Conservative in the Osborne years, even then, the rate of spending was going up. It just wasn't going up as quickly as it had done in the past. There weren't actual, substantial, real cuts. But the austerity was the fact that it wasn't growing. The spending wasn't growing as fast as people wanted.
But the interesting thing is, if you think about Labour worrying about the Greens and the left, Kemi Badenoch worrying about reform and the right, neither side is saying cut public spending.
And actually, it's not, you know, Labour's also worrying about reform as well.
That's right.
And you could have a sort of an interesting situation where you've got, you know, as you say, you might have this kind of weird slight convergence between some of the more left-wing parties and parties like Reform, who are almost becoming a bit more left-wing on economics, while Reform is more right-wing on things like immigration.
So the whole situation is fracturing. I mean, you know, compared to the two-party system we grew up with, I mean, this is completely different.
On the final part,
so we need our economy to grow, basically.
We really do.
Yeah.
But also, if you know, I think cutting public services is just a terrible idea. I mean, I do think the austerity years have brought really difficult things on public services. Just look at policing, for example. But it's also not good for growth if you cut. You know, people sometimes don't make the link between public services and growing the economy. You actually need good public services to grow the economy.
But the problem you've outlined is very difficult because, as you said, you're sticking to your fiscal rules. You've said you're not going to raise tax. So the only thing you can do is actually try and constrain spending.
Yeah, OK, can we...
Or cross your fingers. And chancellors with fingers crossed is never a good look.
Yeah.
I mean, look, you've said it. But this, we're going to come back to this, because I don't think this problem's going to go away.
We've been talking about the sort of increasing furore over grooming gangs and the question of a national inquiry. Of course, that was voted against during the bill. But it's good to have, again, Kwasi, you in this way. We've obviously talked about it on the programme all week, essentially, because it's been this week's big story. But one of the questions, now that you're here, Kwasi, is interesting to hear your take on it, is the rising questions of why it is that Kemi Badenoch and Chris Philp and others, who are now on the opposition benches, 2 years ago were not banging on the drum saying we need another inquiry in 2022. Why are they doing it now in opposition when they had the power?
But they weren't really in charge of the party. I mean, I get it.
I know Kemi Badenoch's talked about collective responsibility, so she didn't have... But that's
I get it.
There are plenty of people who talk up about important issues.
And oppositions always have this problem, especially when they've just lost, they've been in government and they go into opposition. And they have to defend everything that they did in the last 14 years. And actually, in Kemi Badenoch's instance, she wasn't there for half the time, and they were junior ministers. So they weren't really responsible for running the government.
Yeah. She was not a junior minister. She was actually the Minister for Women and Equalities. So that was on her brief.
Right.
For like 2 years.
Yeah, that's right.
And wasn't Chris Philp policing minister?
Yeah, and the jail recommendations.
Yeah.
So I just don't buy that
They weren't
argument.
running the government.
She was the Minister for Women and Equality. She didn't even meet with any of the victims.
But you know how, I mean, no, you haven't been it, but in the terms of the government, the agenda, you know this. It'll be very much set from the top, from number 10.
But I remember Rishi Sunak raising the issue of Asian grooming gangs in Prime Minister's questions.
He did. As a backbencher, I think.
No, as Prime Minister.
Did he do
Prime
that?
Minister's questions, he did.
I don't remember.
In Prime Minister's questions, he did that, but...
Also, I just think...
I don't
understand
that.
The question of a second inquiry, because at the time, the issue was, are you going to implement the findings of the first public
remember,
inquiry?
we had also the moment, that really jaw-dropping moment, when Boris Johnson, who was running the party...
He was running the party.
You accept that? You accept that?
He was in charge.
He made a joke about how we were spaffing all this money up the wall and things like child abuse inquiries.
Well, we have the front page of the Telegraph, which is this story, the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, where the Telegraph says, produced a report a few years ago, saying the headline is Islamophobia law would ban discussion of Asian grooming gangs. They say that Labour agreed with a definition of Islamophobia which said that you shouldn't refer to Asian grooming gangs because that was racist. and was an example of Islamophobia. This is why people are too scared to tell the truth, that it was a modern-day iteration of age-old stereotypes and tropes about Islam, and that discussing grooming gangs could heighten vulnerability of Muslims to hate crimes. And so this was a few years ago, that definition. I mean, as recently as 2019, was politics in Parliament and Labour politics still shying away from using this language?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think that, and I say this as a British Muslim, you know, I think that there has been, not just with the Muslim community, but with lots of different, if you could look at the debate around transgender rights versus biological sex-based rights, there has been a real reluctance to sometimes have open conversations. And I'm sympathetic as to, you know, you obviously want to get the right balance. And I do think there is, let's not kid ourselves, there are some, not all, and I'm really clear about that, there's a small group of people who are weaponising this, who basically hate the idea of the religion of Islam. But I say this as a British Muslim, we have to have these discussions without fear or favour. We have to look whether it's Muslim perpetrators, whether it's Catholic priests or priests from the Church of England.
It sounds like you want another inquiry.
Well, I think we've got to... One of the things that I find really heartbreaking about all of this is what happened was absolutely sickening. And I do think that there are really, really big questions that we still haven't uncovered.
Right. That's right.
And I do think whether you have a national inquiry, I have some sympathy with will another big national inquiry. It could take many, many years. I'm sympathetic. However, I do think there's a lot of discussions we're not going into yet. And I say this as a progressive British Muslim woman. So, I do think that we've got to be able to do this out fear of it. And we also have to do it in a way which we're not just allowing some people who are bad faith actors who don't give a fig about women's rights. Let's not kid ourselves. Some of these Johnny-come-latelys, particularly some of the tech bros that promote things like pornography on their websites, they don't care about women's rights. Do me a favour. But we've got to be able to have these conversations for the sake of the victims.
So, look, I think Ayesha's right, but I think you've got to also... I think what Ed said was right. I think there was a climate maybe a few years ago, where we were very worried about being called Islamophobic. And there was a whole, certainly with the governing party, there were whole stories about, and Saeed Awazi saying that we were Islamophobic. It was a very sensitive issue. And I'm afraid, I think that did spill into not, or turning a blind eye to a lot of these appalling crimes.
But it's interesting, though, you know, because you're very strong on this, Ayesha, but the fact that this idea of having a new national inquiry, it has been voted down. Do you think that's wrong? Do you think it should have? Do you think that Labour should now back the idea? I mean, I know Jess Phillips and Keir Starmer have sort of left the door open saying, if the victims want this, we won't. But it's about timing, isn't it?
Well, I think we have to be clear about what this bill is. I think we have to be clear about what happened last night. That was a sort of wrecking amendment. And that's politics, right? That, you know, that's what happens, you know, that's political.
Explain that.
So that is basically when the opposition will see an opportunity to kind of wreck a bill and get sort of publicity for an issue. What I would genuinely like to see...
The whole of the child welfare bill, if the vote had gone through, would have collapsed.
The whole thing would have collapsed.
Gone.
And there are
all the measures about breakfast clubs or a register of children, that would all have gone.
Exactly.
And as you say, fair enough. As a way of demonstrating your political point, it worked for the Conservatives, but actually they never expected the bill to fill, and I would think they probably didn't want it to fill.
No, exactly, because there's really important safeguarding measures in there that we would all agree with. For example, all the children, that the kind of people that have been lost post-COVID, a register for school, you know, all that stuff. What I would really like to see now, to be absolutely honest, is to take out the kind of, I think, very weaponised politics. And what I would really like to see is I'd like to see all parties, including Reform, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, all the parties coming together. If you are genuinely in good faith wanting to look at this issue about child sexual abuse, come together, stop doing this, like, petty point scoring.
But it's not point scoring. It's not point scoring. You've spoken very eloquently about this.
Hang on, come together. Bring the victims together in a cross-party way and start making some progress. So, I'll tell you what, the women and girls out there, and by the way, there will be people watching this show, women who have been raped or sexually abused, who are waiting for years for their case to be heard.
They want an inquiry. A lot of them want an inquiry.
Not all of them.
But a lot of them do.
A lot of them do. But listen, do you know what? I would much prefer to hear directly from all the victims and with the greatest of respect, not people who were in charge for 14 years who did nothing about this.
So
to that
the issue
point, we
is...
have got a father of one of the victims of these grooming gangs coming on the show this morning, Marlon. His daughter is... she's only 19 now. She's waived her anonymity to allow her father to speak about it. So we will directly be hearing from a father who wants the new inquiry.
They are the people who we should be listening to. I don't think the door should be closed on this. And I'm actually pleased that it feels like from last night, Jess Phillips and the government were saying the door's not completely shut on this. But I think we've got to...
But, you know, we're only doing this because... you know, Elon Musk raised it. I mean,
That's
say you don't want people
Exactly
like
right.
that to get involved in British politics and to be weaponising the idea. The only reason we're talking about it is because
it
that
was
happened.
weaponised.
But that's also the case because in our politics and in a lot of our media and things like that, we also don't talk enough about the epidemic of violence against women and girls. We only talk about it when a horrible case comes up and then we go, oh, it's all terrible. We don't join up the dots. Elon, fine, we might be talking about Elon Musk, about he's racist. You look at his site X now, it is a cesspit of pornography. So how can he on the one hand be saying, oh yeah, I really care about women and girls? You can get porn left, right and centre. It's disgusting what you see on his site now. And he was basically, you know, the way he singled out Jess Phillips. Jess Phillips has done more to help women and girls than all of these tech bros will do in their entire lives.
Agree on that.
They are not fit
Yes.
to lick her boots when it comes to protecting women and girls.
But the fact is, he raised the issue and we're talking about it.
We are talking about it, and we're talking about Asian grooming gangs, but we're also talking about the fact that the large majority of child sex abuse happens by white men and women with their own families.
And it often happens in the family as well.
right,
often happens in the family.
Keep this in perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to see you at the end of the show so we can reflect on the conversation we had with Marlon and former Chief Constable of Norfolk Constabulary, Simon Bailey. So we'll pick this up in a little while.